So I want to continue in chapter 11, talking about school spending and financing and how it's governed. Um, this is the last slide that I showed you in the previous video. And one thing I wanted to go back to and mention here is the amount of money in our book on page 354. There are a couple of charts, 354 and then 355, a couple of charts that indicate how much money is spent per pupil in in the United States. And I find this really interesting. In 2004, in the United States, the amount spent per student, so per pupil, was a little over $8,000. In 2014, the amount per pupil was $11,373. So you can see that the increase is coming. The government's trying to do a better job of putting more money per student into schools, because the number of students is not decreasing. It's steadily increasing, as we've seen in other things we've talked about in this class. But I do find it interesting that that number is growing slightly. It's not growing by a ton, but it is growing slightly. And so states are trying to put more money into education. Now, on page 355 in the book, there's an average expenditure per pupil by state. And I find this really interesting. The state of Vermont is spending around around $21,000 per student in that state. Now, is that a product of it's a small state, and so they can put more money per kid because maybe there's not as many kids? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. New York, which is obviously very heavily populated, they're putting around 20,000 per pupil into the school district. Again, states that are spending more than the United States. Okay, so we've got this number of 11,000 per student, per pupil, from a federal level. States that are spending more than the United States per pupil: Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Hawaii, West Virginia, Illinois, District of Columbia, so it's Washington, D.C., Michigan, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Wyoming, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Alaska, New Jersey, New York, Vermont. Now, most of those are in the northeast part of the country, kind of getting to the central north over to Wisconsin and Minnesota, and then even down to Indiana and Illinois. So you can kind of picture that on the map, right? You do have Hawaii and Alaska both that are obviously not connected to the other 48 states. But most of these states are in that upper northern part of the country, into northern central and northern eastern part. And everybody else is spending less. In fact, in Mississippi, we're spending less than $9,000 per pupil. So the government is spending $11,000 per pupil, and then in Mississippi we're spending less than less than $9,000. And Mississippi is not the lowest. And again, this is as of 2014. North Carolina, Texas, Oklahoma, Utah, and Arizona were spending less per pupil than Mississippi. And so again, you can look at that chart. I just found that really interesting as we continue to talk about school spending and what's being spent on each student. And so this discussion then leads us to a couple of court cases that have been influential in finance reform for schools. So in 1971, there was a class action lawsuit, Serrano versus Priest, that charged California's school financing scheme was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court of California supported the parents' claim that the quality of the child's education must not be a function of wealth other than wealth of the state as a whole. Okay, so think about that. What's happening here in this situation is one area in California, based on the wealth of that neighborhood, the wealth of that town or city, they're getting more money based on the wealth they have, versus the more poor areas are not receiving as much money for education. And so obviously you can imagine education is not as successful there, because as students are being taught by those teachers probably are not the better teachers because they're taking less money. Not to say that every teacher is just about money, but if you get offered a job to teach and make one amount of money that's much more than another amount, and you probably are getting better students with the higher amount, you're probably going to take that, right? And so the inner city poor areas like of Los Angeles, for example, maybe we're getting less money. And so the Supreme Court of California supported the parents' claim that the quality of education must not be a function of wealth other than wealth of the city as the state as a whole. The court has upheld that the California system financing schools only based on local property taxes violated the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which provides equal protection of the law for all citizens. Okay, so think about that. If you are strictly financing a school district based on taxes brought in from that area, well, then you're discriminating against those that don't have a very high property tax, right? That's going to be your very poor rural areas. The property tax is not going to be as high, and so therefore they're in this California's financing scheme. You're not going to have very much money for education. Where if you live in an area that has multi-million-dollar houses and very, very wealthy people that are paying a lot of money for property tax, well, then you're going to have more money for education. And so California's scheme was found to be unconstitutional. However, in 1973, what is known as the Rodriguez case reversed a similar decision, because it said, and this happened in Texas, it said that the court found that the U.S. Constitution was not violated by the right to an education, because the right to an education is not guaranteed explicitly or implicitly by the Constitution. Okay, so the U.S. Constitution does not mention your right to education. Now, a lot of local state constitutions do have clauses about receiving quality education or equal education. And so that case said that Texas was not in the wrong for using state tax, property tax, or property tax in a school, in an area, to finance or determine how much money is gotten from that state. However, the U.S. Constitution does contain protections about equal rights, which is what California used. And this Rodriguez case really brought a lot of states into question their educational financing scheme, because they didn't really feel like it was a good thing necessarily to have their financing scheme be based on property tax. And so as a result of court challenges, more than 23 states have reformed their school finance laws since 1973. Now, taxes are a part of the financing scheme in Mississippi. That's why when you go to a school district like Tupelo, your local supplement may be $3,000. If you go to, let's say, Oxford, excuse me. If you go to Oxford, the local supplement is pretty high because, again, they have a lot of taxes, they have a lot of a wealthier community. In Itawamba County, the local supplement's very low because you don't have as much money, as much wealth in that school district. And so, when I was at New Albany, it was kind of in between. It wasn't as much as, say, a Tupelo, but it wasn't as low as, say, Itawamba County. And so you kind of had an in between because there's some property value there, there's some wealth that are obviously paying taxes, and that tax money is being used for those local supplements. And every school district in Mississippi has to pay a supplement, but they're only required to pay like $1. I mean, it doesn't have to be anything substantial. Depending on your school district, again, you may have a really good local supplement. If you're in South Haven, DeSoto County, that area, you're going to have a really good local supplement because that economy up there is booming. That area is growing. And so you're going to have more money available to pay teachers. In Tunica, even though that school district itself is not thought of as a great school district, low test scores and things of that sort, they can pay a lot of money because they've got casinos that are bringing in a lot of money. And so there are some areas in our state where there's a really good local supplement, which helps the fact that the state pay is maybe not as good. So, some other ways that you can get money in education, or that at schools get money. Number one is through grants. There are grants that are being written. My wife this year was given an extra supplement to be a grant writer for her school. And basically what she does is she tries to find different businesses and companies around that are willing to give money to education. She writes a grant. If they accept it, then they give money to the school. And when you get a grant, it's that money's spent specifically on whatever the grant said it would be spent on. At ICC, we write grants a good bit. I've written some. I haven't gotten any because I don't really know what I'm doing from the grant writing standpoint much, but I have gotten some. I've written some grant proposals to be able to get money to finance some things I've worked on. And so schools a lot of times will do that. They'll apply for grants to get money for different areas. That's why, for example, at ICC, you may hear us talk about our budgets have been cut, but we built a brand new building on our Tupelo campus. Well, that building is paid for by federal grants. And I don't know specifics of all that. And maybe that building wasn't in particular, but some of the buildings are. Our band hall, for example, it serves as the band hall, but also as a storm shelter, because that was a grant from FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association, that gave us money to build a storm shelter on campus. Well, they were able to build it in such a way that it can also be used as our band hall, but if there's bad weather, we have to open that up so people can go in the community to that building for a storm shelter. And so you find a lot of school districts find creative ways to use money they get from grants to make improvements without it coming straight out of their school budget. And so a lot of times when you see a building go up and you hear the school say, oh, we're out of money, we don't have, we can't give teachers a raise, or we can't do this or can't do that financially, but then you see a brand new building, a lot of times that's what's happened. They've gotten grants. All right, so some other places that money is spent in education is in high poverty areas. There's a lot of focus a lot of times on what we call the lower 25% students. Those are the students that are projected to not do well, to be at a risk of failure, there's all the time money being poured into trying to help those students, because those students, based on No Child Left Behind, we're trying to not leave anybody behind, and so we're putting money into helping that lower 25. This is oftentimes funded through Title I of NESEA, which is now No Child Left Behind. And again, it's just a way to try to move every student as far as they can go, move them to the highest level possible, and not leave anybody behind. There's also preventative programs like preschools and Head Starts that are federally financed. Head Start is a preschool that is financed by federal money, and that's a program that can be a really great thing, especially if it's done well and students are learning there. Then it helps them be prepared when they get into school. There's also some intervention things that money gets poured into, trying to provide basic skills, success for all, providing remediation or tutoring or dropout prevention, job training, adult literacy. Those are all things within our communities and within our schools that money can go into. A lot of times maybe those are financed through grants. Maybe they're financed by the federal government saying, okay, we're going to give each school district X amount of money to make this program, design this program, run this program, whatever. And so those are all things, again, trying to keep people in school, trying to help people be productive members of society when they get out of school. And so we have a lot of intervention type things that happen. And then when we talk about this early intervention, it seems, so that's the preschool, the Head Start. That seems to be the most successful. These other intervention, the remediation, the tutoring, dropout prevention, you have evaluations that are kind of mixed on that. Some of those programs work really well. Some of those programs do not work. At ICC, we do some things similar to this too. We have our academic support center, and we have students that we're encouraging to go to that. Some students are required to go to that for a class. And the idea is we want to try to get as much intervention, as much help as needed before it's too late. Sometimes those are successful, sometimes those are not. Hopefully, if students buy in, then it is successful. But again, because of the mixed results, you have mixed evaluations. Some people say, well, why don't we put money into this? It's not that successful. Or why don't we put money into that? Because it's not that successful. From an educational standpoint, one way I sort of look at it is, if it's successful at all and it helps anybody, then it's probably been a success. Now, is it worth the amount of money we're putting into it? Well, that's a whole different story. Maybe, maybe not. But does the intervention itself work? If it's helping people, then yeah, it works. And so, as we talk about education and how it's financed and influenced and even governed, the finance piece is the main piece. It's what is most debated in education, because there's just not enough money, and the odds of changing that quickly are not good, especially in Mississippi. But it is getting better, and hopefully we can take the funds that are allowed, put that into helping teachers be better and do better each year. This does finish out chapter 11. This is our last. I don't know where the slide went. There it goes. This is our last chapter. This is our last section. I hope you have learned a lot from this class. We didn't finish the way we intended, but that's okay. We have covered everything that we needed to cover in this class. And so if you have any questions or anything that you need clarification on or need me to explain more, let me know. My plan is for you to have a test on chapters 9, 10, and 11. So just kind of hitting the high points of those 3 chapters. And then we'll be ready to take our final exam. Be looking at Canvas and emails and all those things for announcements and due dates of what's coming up over the next week or 2.